the chilly northern boundaries of the known elven world, live a dying race of dark elves called the Morkald. They are so called because of their dark nature of hatred, jealousy, greed and malevolence, particularly against the kingdom of High Elves, who they wish to overthrow and so finally claim the elven kingdoms for themselves. However, for centuries, due to much infighting and inbreeding, their race is slowly self-destructing and dying. One of the Morkald was called Org. He was a young, bright and ambitious member of the Council of Magic, with a mysterious dark persona, but having a sense of hierarchy and superiority over his elders. The season before the long night once again descended onto the elven world. There came a night when there was a strange alignment of the planets, resulting in a plethora of falling stars from the heavens. This particular night, Org happened to be walking back to his dwelling when he saw such a falling star, which did not dissolve into the atmosphere, but landed in the dark woods near to his home. There was a strange glow coming from the woods where the object had fallen. When Org approached, he saw the small glowing object, perfectly round and mesmerizing. It was an orb of power. Over time, Org used this orb of power for his own deeds. He learnt to harness its powers, becoming a masterful magician, surpassing his elders with ambition to finally control the elven world. He amassed a great army of dark elves, goblins, gremlins and gnomes to rise up against the High Elves. The Great Elven War is now written in the histories. But after the creation of the United Elven Realms, when all the elven kingdoms fought together as one, Org was finally defeated, stripped of his powers, and his orb of power seized and flung into the Karen Sea, where it could never be found. Org was banished back into the frozen northern wilderness. The orb descended into the deepest depths of the sea, where it settled amongst the ruins of an ancient civilization lost many millennia ago. The orb was found by the merfolk, who are now the citizens of the lost Skageran kingdom. The High Elves made a pact with the merfolk, who would protect and guard the Orb of Power in their underwater kingdom. The merfolk built a shrine around the orb, but then the most magical thing happened. The orb began to emit beautiful magical particles into the sea, turning the sea a bright, luminescent turquoise green. All the sea creatures of the sea began to glow and shimmer with beautifully shining fluorescent colours. It was an amazing transformation. Ever since that time, the Skageran Sea has become known as the Enchanted Sea. After receipt of the goblin demand, King Gerwan immediately called an emergency meeting with the High Elf Council. The The Book of Light was an ancient treasure of the High Elves, a magical tome that was paramount in creating a safe haven for his kingdom of Fey folk during the time of the Long Night. The council recognized that the goblins would wish to destroy the Book of Light for their own purposes, and King Garwan, realizing the possible consequences of losing the book, not only for the kingdom, but for every one of his citizens, put forward that a swift, decisive rescue mission should be organized as quickly as possible. Aldher reminded the gathering that the Dark Lord Org, who was likely in league with the goblins, must also wish to seize the book for his own purposes. Only the elves know that the Book of Light is useless to anyone without the last elf to wield it and set forth the magic. And this last elf's identity is now being kept a secret until the book is again needed. However, Org may still have some powers to retrieve the spells from the book. The king and council agreed that they will play the goblins and the Dark Lord's game, stalling for time, by initially agreeing to the terms, giving them time to put a rescue plan together. A reply would be sent to the goblins, and messages would be sent to the Dragonborn and the other elven communities regarding their plans. Org was just as ambitious as he had ever been, and throughout the centuries of his banishment, had spent his time travelling the cold and desolate northern territories, increasing his experience, wisdom, and knowledge of magic. He had made himself a vow that he would eventually retrieve the two most magical objects of power, which were now in High Elven hands: the Book of Light and his lost Orb of Power. Now at last, the Book of Light was almost in his grasp. He had used the goblins as pawns to kidnap the princess, but at the final time of the exchange, he would then appear to the goblins once again as the Dark Stranger and retrieve the book from them. Galea was cold, hungry, and uncomfortable, and her hands were sore, having been tightly bound with rough ropes. She wondered fearfully what the goblins wanted with her, and her mind raced with evil scenarios. The goblins usually kept themselves hidden, living out their lives away from the light. What had enticed them out, and why would they want to capture her? It was another century yet until the next long night would descend upon them, and the Book of Light would keep them away. More surprisingly, why had the spinny fairies betrayed them on their journey? What could their reason be? Galea was confused, feeling as if she was living through a nightmare, and that surely she would wake. Time dragged on. She watched the goblins devour their meal of swamp toads, and her stomach retched. After a time, the goblins quietened and settled down as if to sleep around the small fire in the center of the cave. She couldn't sleep. Her mouth was dry, her stomach ached, and she coughed in the smoky atmosphere of the cave. A little while later, something attracted her attention from a far corner of the cave. In the dim light, she saw a familiar face appear around the rock. Could it possibly be? It was Thoran. Mother be praised. What was he doing here, and how had he found her? Tears sprung to her eyes with love and disbelief. He was cautious, Any noise would surely disturb the goblins. Thoran crept towards Galea with soft steps. Reaching her, he quickly drew out his knife and severed the ropes that bound her wrists, all the while glancing back at the sleeping goblins. Galea's freed arms encircled Thoran's neck, and she hugged him tightly with gentle sobs. He touched her lips with his finger to quieten her, and gently helped her up from the cold floor. Taking her hand, they both crept slowly, keeping close to the wall. Thoran had in his belt pouch a wad of valerian leaves. The woodland elves are schooled in all the plants of the forest and their uses. He knew that these leaves would induce sleepiness with contact with the warm fire. As quietly as he could, he tiptoed back to the center of the cave, crushed the leaves in his palm, and sprinkled them onto the fire, where they began to smolder. There was a loud grunt from one of the goblins, which made Thoran jump and reach for his dagger. But the goblin snored and repositioned itself. Thoran and Galea, hand in hand, crept quietly into the darkness beyond. Through her magic training, Galea knew how to create a light orb by rubbing her hands together. However, her body was so cold, the light was feeble, but just enough to guide them. Thoran looked for his scratch markings to direct them out through the caverns and tunnels that they had entered through, back to the safety of the mountainside and the forest beyond. Galea was weak and tired on the way back down the mountainside. Thoran filled his water container from the waterfalls and gave her water and gathered a few berries to feed her. It was almost dawn when they reached the village in the fantasy forest. Galea was completely exhausted. She could go no further. The closest house was that of his brother, Eoron, and his family. He would take her there, where she would be well cared for. Galea was feverish and deathly pale when she entered the house. Eoron and Laena were going about their morning routine and were astonished to find Thoran in their home with the princess, and to see her in such a sorry state. Laena quickly got to work in gently bathing Galea and preparing potions to treat her fever. She was given some bread and warm broth and then left to sleep in one of their children's beds. Thoran discussed with his brother the terrible sequence of events. They did not know why the goblins had taken Galea, but they knew they must send word at once to the High King that she was safe in their hands. Meanwhile, the Silver Army was amassing in Eryndeil. The Dragonborn were also rallying their army, accompanied by their dragon kin, either riding draped around the shoulders of the High Dragonborn or flying along above. King Erwan was preparing to meet with his generals when a messenger owl came to Fialfosserin early that morning. The news was incredible. Galea had been rescued by a single woodland elf ranger. She was being cared for by a woodland elf family in the forest below the mountains. King Erwan and Queen Alina hugged each other with relief and joy.